So thank you for your forbearance. And Duncan, we're very glad that you're here to lead us for this new series. So let's hand over and welcome Duncan and say thank you, and off you go.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. I'm really excited about this new series because honestly, it really touches my heart, which is a form of pop music, but a special form of pop music. I've been crazy about rock and roll and soul and reggae and funk and jazz for many, many years. And my sort of first great friend who shared that passion is with us this evening, and that's the Reverend Stephen Hans, or Steve as I always call him, because we've been friends since we were about 15, and we've been, this is no exaggeration, we have been to hundreds of concerts together, and we are both massively enthusiastic record collectors, and this summer one of our favorite record shops and record labels, Honest John's, gave us the fantastic surprise that they were starting to reissue a series of African-American gospel records that were recorded from the 1950s into the 1980s on the Savoy label, which was one of the great record labels of that period. Here's one example of them. Edith Moreno, Get Ready for Judgment Day, a wonderful funky gospel record. And there's lots more where this came from. But I'm absolutely intrigued by this kind of music, and I thought it would be a fascinating issue to talk about during a Bible study series, because the roots of these songs are in the Bible, but they've come through a fascinating path. Most of them were written by English songwriters or had some origin in English hymnaries, and then they were taken to the United States. Some were adapted into Negro spirituals, and then many decades later, they became African-American songs that were sung by choirs or quartets or soloists, and they're still alive and relevant today. So over the course of this series, we'll be hearing about their biblical roots, their musical roots, what they mean in the context of Pentecostal churches, and in particular, what they mean to singers and audiences in London, both Christian and secular. There's lots of ground to cover, actually, and the songs themselves are an absolute delight. So the plan is that we'll have a guest in each week who will join us and listen to a song together and reflect on it in a conversation with me for about 10 minutes. And then, of course, we'll lead open to a discussion, because I'm really fascinated to hear what your perspective on these songs are. It doesn't really matter if you haven't heard them before, because I'd like to know your reaction. And if you're interested in the Bible stories, of course, then I'm also fascinated to hear how you respond to hearing scripture in these songs too. But Steve's here. So Steve, can I ask you to introduce yourself and talk us into the video that you've chosen, please?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Duncan. It's lovely to be here and to see you all. What can I tell you? I work for the Church of England. I am the Church of England's national lead for evangelism and witness. So I'm kind of responsible for, helping the church to think about how we communicate the faith. In normal times, I work out of an office at Church House, Westminster, just behind the Abbey. In these times, I work out of my home in Streatham in South London. I've been in that role for a year and a bit. Before that, I was the Dean of Derby, running the cathedral there. And before that, I've been in different parishes, worked at Southwark Cathedral, south of the Thames as well. And as Duncan said, we became friends in a kind of Christian Union group, really, when we were 14, 15 years old. When we were both kind of discovering all of this kind of wonderful music. And my experience of this was, I kind of fell in love with music, really, when I was, starting from when I was kind of 9 or 10. And I grew up in quite a sort of conservative Christian home. My parents were Baptists at that time. We went to the Baptist church, and they were quite kind of cagey, really, quite anxious about the influence of, you know, rock and roll on their impressionable young son. So they were forever trying to kind of steer me towards music that they thought would be, you know, upbuilding and kind of good for my soul. And it was on the back of this that my mother, who is not one of the world's great, you know, rock music aficionados, asked me sometime in about 1980, when I was 14 years old, if I knew that Bob Dylan was now a Christian. Well, I didn't really know anything very much about Bob Dylan, but I was kind of interested in this. And I bought a record which was fairly new at that time, called Slow Train Coming, which was the first of a trilogy of records that Bob Dylan made that were very overtly Christian in lyrical content, but also drew very heavily on a sort of black gospel tradition as well, in terms of some of the musical content. So I guess that was one of the routes. It wasn't the only one, but it was one of the routes for me in kind of exploring that bit of kind of music history, listening to some of these soul and gospel singers, many of them from many years ago. And it's a kind of glorious thread, because once you start pulling at it, you know, everything leads to something else. So you kind of listen to Bob Dylan doing Slow Train Coming, and somebody says, oh yes, but you know, there's these kind of black gospel singers on there, and they've made this record, and you listen to that, and then you discover that actually these are all songs that are based on, as Duncan said, you know, Negro spirituals from 50 years before or whatever. So you kind of listen to that, and it never kind of stops, which is why you can see a tiny fraction of a record collection which has taken over my home, just kind of behind my left shoulder. So yeah, there we are. That's kind of me. So I guess it's probably more the musical expertise than my ministry as an Anglican priest, which has brought me to the table this evening. But this is a kind of conversation that I've had with Duncan and with other friends many times over the years. And when I was working at Southwark Cathedral, I'll finish on this. When I was working at Southwark Cathedral, I once did a whole a Holy Week retreat, which was entitled, if I remember rightly, "Serves Me Right to Suffer, something, the Gospel and the Blues." And I really enjoyed this. And I had this group of people to work with who didn't really know very much about this. But basically, I just kind of, you know, played gospel and blues and bits of jazz and sort of explain where it came from and why I was kind of enthusiastic about it. And it was great fun. So I've been looking forward to that conversation tonight as well.
Great, thank you, Steve. Well, the record that we've chosen to listen to, actually it's a YouTube clip, it's also a record, is by the Caravans. This is a late recording of it. I think they recorded it first in 1958, actually. But the song we know has been sung by African-American groups since at least 1915. I think it was part of the repertoire of the Fisk Gospel Singers, who were so impressive that I think Queen Victoria met them and hosted them at Buckingham Palace when they toured Britain, which is pretty incredible. I don't think even the Rolling Stones managed that. But the song goes back to the Negro spiritual period. And all of its imagery is drawn from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as you'll hear in this rendition, it's the way different passages of the Bible come together in the narrative, which makes it so fascinating and powerful. Hallelujah indeed. What a terrific clip that is. Thanks for finding that, Steve. As you've observed before, normally when someone is stung by the grief of a close relative, the first thing you do to comfort them is not remind them that many people have drowned in a terrible accident. caused by God. So why does the fact that Pharaoh's army's been drowned in the Red Sea apply to the story of Mary and Martha? Can you explain what's happening?
Yes, I think I can, and this is why I chose this song, because it gets us not only into gospel music, but it gets us into a kind of Black American spirituality and theology, which is shaped by quite a different set of influences and experiences to those which have shaped hymnody and theology in the West, where, you know, our theology and our Christian music has been shaped by an experience of power and privilege for the most part. That is not the case for the spirituality of African Americans, which was shaped, as we've already said, during the period of slavery. So what's going on in this song? It's really, you can sum it up. If you remember one word, the word to remember is Exodus. It's about the Exodus, and the Exodus, the story of God leading his people out of slavery in Egypt into the promised land, is absolutely determinative for African American spirituality and for the Black gospel tradition. And you don't need to be a great historian to work out why that might be. You know, what is the, if you're part of a community of slaves, or you're descended from a community of slaves, and you're still living with some of the legacy of that injustice and that oppression and that being second-rate people in the land that you have been brought to, what is the biblical story that really resonates with you? Well, God delivered his people from slavery and brought them into promised land. So in English hymnody, you will not find, I think, very much about the Exodus. It's not a kind of controlling image or metaphor for very much of kind of Western Christian or religious songwriting, but in Black American gospel songwriting, it absolutely is, and here's why. So the narrative of the song is fascinating. There are basically 3 lines in that song. You know, we watched it for 4.5 minutes. There are 3 lines. "Oh, Mary, don't you weep, Martha, don't you moan. Pharaoh's army got drowned in the Red Sea." And then in the second verse, "Pharaoh's army got drowned in the Red Sea" is replaced by, "If I could, I'd stand on the rock where Moses stood." Okay, so what is going on here? In the gospel story, we have Jesus talking to Mary and Martha after their brother Lazarus has died. So what he's actually wanting to say to them, and if you look it up in the Gospels, what Jesus actually is recorded as saying is, don't worry, he will rise again. And I think it's Mary, who says, well, we know he'll rise again on the last day. And Jesus kind of says, well, yeah, maybe sooner than that, actually. But the way that the song has been written, that message about the coming resurrection, that Lazarus is going to come back to life, has been replaced with this line about the Exodus. So what are we being told? What we're being told is that the reason that we can be confident that Lazarus will rise again, and indeed by implication that everybody has the potential for resurrection, the reason we can have that faith is because God led his people out of slavery and into the promised land. That is the mighty act of God in the past, the unbelievable act of God in the past, which gives confidence in the equally unbelievable act of God in the future, that Lazarus and Jesus and ultimately all of us will rise again. And what I think is, and I hadn't thought about the second verse until I was watching this clip earlier this week in preparation for this taught, because in the second verse, you know, you have this line of, I'd stand on the rock where Moses stood. And I was thinking, what's that about? And I think what that's about is, as you come to, if you remember the story from the book of Exodus, as Moses comes towards the end of his life, the people that he has led out of slavery, they haven't yet reached the promised land. And they're still kind of wandering around in the desert. And God says to Moses in the story, look, you're going to die before they get there. You aren't going to get to lead the people into the promised land. But here's what I will do. I will let you glimpse it. And Moses goes up on a rock, on a mountain, and he looks out over this promised land of milk and honey, where the people are going to make their home, and God's promises are going to be fulfilled. So what's going on in that verse of the song, you know, the other reason for Mary and Martha not to moan, not to be scared, and by implication for all the kind of worshippers and those who are going to sing this song, not to moan and not to be scared, is because in God's grace and providence, they can stand from where they are in their position of slavery or oppression or poverty, but look out to the promised land, which God is going to lead his people into in America. They're going to be liberated there. And so both of those things are in the song. There's the looking back to God's great act in the past, and there's the looking forward to the glimpses that they already have, believed by faith they have anyway, of the promised land, of freedom from slavery, and of full participation in the land to which they have been taken. And those are the reasons for Mary and Martha not to moan. God has intervened dramatically in the past. God will intervene dramatically in the future. You don't need to be afraid. It's going to be all right.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you for drawing out those different elements in it. There's one other theme that runs through it, which I've picked up in many other Black gospel songs as well, which is about the reunification of a separated family. This can sometimes be expressed in the idea, well, I looked over Jordan and I saw my family on the other side. And actually, it almost runs through when the saints come marching in. Because when the word saints is not about some special people who've done no wrong in their lives. Saints was used as a general term for people who were Christians or worshippers in Black Pentecostal churches. When they come marching in and they're reunited, the community is restored. And the most traumatic experience for African Americans in the legacy of slavery was the separation of their families and their villages and their languages. Their culture was divided. And there is an echo of that, I think, in this song, that yes, it's sad that Lazarus has died, but it's a separation of family that's been caused by the death. And so this female comforting of sisters together actually is very resonant as well, because in a sense, that was one of the functions of the songs, that they were a form by which sisters who weren't physically from the same family, but had a shared experience, could comfort one another. And it also strikes me, this is my last point, is how the words of Christ are entirely internalized. So I think she does say, I heard Jesus say, but the song starts with, "Oh Mary, don't you weep, oh Martha, don't you weep." It's a female voice singing it to other women. So it's her message as the singer, and it's thus the congregation's message as they sing it together. And she wants to stand on the rock where Moses stood. It then becomes personal. And so somehow these songs bring the biblical message right at the emotional center of these people's experience. And that's, I think, why they're so moving. And the more you hear them, and particularly in a performance like that, you know, sometimes I find myself very deeply touched by it.
Mm.
That's my
I think that's absolutely right, Duncan. And I think, you know, again, I mean, I was talking about the difference in kind of cultural context and historical context between the way in which African American gospel music and Christian music has been shaped as against you know, in our own country, in this country. But of course, I mean, one of the things which goes with that is that there is a much greater sense of the corporate, of the communal in African American life, in the Black gospel tradition. In the West, a lot of religious faith, Protestant Christian faith particularly, can be very individualistic. It's about me, my relationship with God, what I personally believe. You know, we put a lot of emphasis on the individual. The Black gospel tradition does not do that. It's communal. It's about, as you were saying, Duncan, it's about family. It's about the wider, you know, the whole family of the church, of the community. And so, you know, I think you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought of it this way. But when you say, you know, Lazarus's death you know, it's a rupture in the family. And so part of what this is about the kind of restoration of relationship. And of course, it's absolutely true. And not just in terms of people being taken from, you know, Ghana or wherever and separated from their from their village and the people who were left there, but also, you know, families were split up, families were divided on the auction block. Families went different ways and never saw each other again. So the longing for the restoration of the family, I'll be again with those whom I love, is an incredibly important part of the longing for liberation and deliverance from slavery as well.
Thank you, Stephen. I wonder whether anybody else would like to give their reflections or responses to the music.
You're on mute, Duncan.
Julian, I think you had something that you might like to say.
I was going to say, Duncan, that I found it very difficult to understand the words. It wasn't very clear to me. Now, I think you and your colleague are very familiar with this, and so it was fairly easy, perhaps, for you to work out what they were actually singing. But I couldn't work out most of what they were singing.
Yeah, well, it's a very emotional rendition. And it was clear that the congregation behind them knew every word, because when they heard the opening notes, they thought, oh, great, the Caravans are going to sing, Oh, Mary, Don't You Weep Again. So it was written on their hearts. They'd heard it thousands of times, and they knew it was the Caravans' greatest hit, actually. Inez Andrews must have sung it hundreds of times in churches, you know, throughout the South and in Chicago and everything. But I hear what you say. I mean, the delivery of this type of gospel music is very different to the sort of gentle intonation of hymns in English churches, isn't it? It's much more emotional. Julian.
I noticed, Stephen, that you were born in Africa, and I wonder if part of your interest comes from some very obvious rhythms from Africa, which got translated over to the southern states. And the only rider I would put is that if you want to see good gospel music in a Baptist environment in the United States, it's usually best not to go for First Baptist in a town, which is almost invariably WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but go for something like 13th the 14th when you're going to get a really rocking reception like that?
Julian, I think that's very sound advice. I'm amazed you know I was born in Africa. Very well informed. But yes, I was born in Kenya, although I was only there as a baby. So my parents came back before I was 1. So I suspect that my memories of the musical life of Western Kenya may not have been in fact all that significant, but who knows?
Interestingly, I think that different denominations of Black majority churches in America have different approaches towards gospel music. The Baptists are quite conservative. Mahalia Jackson was a Baptist. Aretha Franklin was a Baptist. And I think they would have been careful about making sure that everybody understood the words, do it slowly, make it clear. Whereas somebody like the Caravans, I don't know exactly, but I'm almost certain they would have derived their inspiration from the Church of God in Christ, which is a much more expressive, demonstrative form of Pentecostal worship. But even there, I think be careful, because it's always very controlled. There's a lot of artistry in these use of voices. It's not just people letting go of their emotions. They're expressing it with all the skill of a very experienced opera singer, in my opinion. Hazel.
We were like Frank, we couldn't hear the words at all, but it came over with real feeling. And I was very grateful for Stephen's exposition afterwards, because then it all made sense.
Solomon, what's your observation?
Yes, I want to thank both of you for such strong analysis of the music and the history behind it. Well, as you know, I'm from Liberia. This is the country where I was born, and this really resonated with me in a deeper sense, because slavery did that, what I call the third option, where people had but then they decided to return to Africa, and coincidentally they founded Liberia. And life wasn't that pleasant, but I think life wasn't that pleasant in the sense that they dominated the political system for a very long time, and then that interaction with the natives brought about the disintegration of Liberia in a strong sense. So when you were given that analysis, that resonated with me very well, and the richness of the song from slavery that also was transported back to Africa. And I did, growing up, I experienced that very firsthand. So if you draw the analysis from the African Americans and those that returned to Africa and lived there, and then took that song and in protest of their experience, that resonated very well. Why they was just put into America, returned back, and they took that protest song, back to Africa. I think that was very strong for me, in a sense.
Do you think people would have?
It's really interesting, and one of the things which I think is worth considering, just back in the slavery context, is how subversive some of these gospel songs could be, and quite deliberately so. So if historically there was the experience of many people who had been brought as slaves from Africa to the USA or to plantations elsewhere, of a kind of forced conversion. Mm. You had to leave the faith that you had practiced, and you had to become Christian. So to sort of accept that was, in a sense, there was a kind of conformity about that. You know, you needed to conform to the religious norms of those who now had power over you. But then listen to what's going on in the songs that they then create and evolve for themselves, because actually that's a song from within a Christian tradition, which is in fact about looking beyond the power that the slave owner has and looking for a kingdom which is greater and which will overturn this kind of injustice. So, you know, the very, what am I saying? That the very Christian language which has been enforced on people by those in power is used to carefully and creatively and subtly communicate a message of subversive hope. And they're using the language of the oppressor to communicate a message of subversive hope. And I think there's a real, real power in that. And that's one of the ways, of course, in which, that tradition doesn't overlap with, for example, the tradition of English hymnody, because that's not where we've been. But I think there's something really clever going on about how those songs and that musical tradition evolves.
Right.
Simon.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Thank you, Stephen. I've been looking up the lyrics for their version to make sure I've got them in my mind. I'm always interested in the way people use scripture in song lyrics. It's kind of, a hobby, spotting scriptural references in songs and trying to work out which bit of scripture they come from. And I just wanted to come back and just sort of seek a bit of further clarification on this rock that Moses stands on, because I've just been kind of going through the book of Exodus. And the only place I can find him standing on a rock is in between the first and the second giving of the 10 commandments on the law. So, he does the first one and then they get dropped and smashed because of the golden calf, and he goes back up again. And before he gets the second one, God says, here is a rock that you will stand on, and you will hide in the cleft of this rock, and I will pass by and you won't see me. And then when you look, you'll see my back. And then he gives him the words of the law again. And that's obviously, in terms of British hymnody, that's where we get Rock of Ages cleft for me coming from. And I wasn't sure whether that might be what's being referred to there, this sense of being held safe by God, hidden in the cleft of the rock, as Moses was with God passing by. But I mean, we will never really know. But that was just that's the only time I can find him standing on a rock.
I'll see either while we're still talking or later on if I can find the reference that I was thinking of.
Yeah,
but, Simon, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. And of course that could be right, that could be it. Or it could function at a number of different levels. And in a way, I think that's one of the, that's one of the beauties of it. As I said, I mean, that 4-minute performance has a grand total of about 3 different lines in it.
Yeah.
Whereas a 4-minute English hymn would probably have, 7 stanzas of 8 verses of 8 lines each. Each word full of theological meaning and complexity. And so, there's something about the way in which the sort of simplicity of the language, which allows you to kind of engage in a different way and to find different levels of meaning in it. You could have somebody else sitting in my chair having this conversation with Duncan, who spotted a whole other set of references that I haven't occurred to me, or is reading the song in a different way. And we might both be right. I mean, this is my best stab at it. Yeah. But that's part of the beauty of it, that because it's so heartfelt, it permits you to sort of engage with it in a variety of different ways, and to resonate with a number of different scriptural images as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like community poetry, isn't it? This isn't one person has written this. This is a song that's arisen from the community. So it's probably meaning several different things to all the people standing around singing it, even on that one occasion, because it will resonate with where they're at and their imagery.
Thank you, Simon. Conrad, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I wanted to just apologize that I joined very late. I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes for a meeting, but happy to jump in. And just in response to Simon's point. If you look at the lyrics, the way I'd always heard it is that it's, if I could, I surely would stand on the rock where Moses stood. Pharaoh's army got drowned. And so there's a juxtaposition that they're on the rock watching the army get drowned. And so I always just understood it as not a specific rock, but solid ground watching the enemy or the heathen or whatever it is going down in the flood. So.
I think there is a lyrical variation in one of the other versions that the Caravans recorded, where they sing, I want to stand on the rock where Moses stood, where God wrote down his love. That, which puts us in the position of the sort of 10 Commandments, but and they also riff more deeply sometimes about the about getting close to what Jesus, they recount Jesus in another version, they recount all the words that Jesus said to reassure the sisters while they were waiting for Lazarus's resurrection. So they do riff on it, but they riff with scripture very much in their minds, actually. And I think the other thing to say is that very often these songs I don't know what the original situation was when it appeared in the mid-19th century, but by the time, 58, when the Caravans recorded it for the first time, it had been used as part of worship services for 70 years in Black Pentecostal churches. And it integrated with the sermon and the rest of the event. So the sermon and the scripture reading and the song would have been very closely connected. And when the Steve and I have been fortunately to some Black Pentecostal churches in America, when the great preachers are preaching, they are also singing, and the audiences are responding and moaning, in fact, in response. There's this little irony there, actually, because in African-American churches, to moan is by no means a bad thing. To moan means that you are responding vocally, expressing your emotional and spiritual harmony with what's being expressed by the rest of the congregation in their worship. So when she says, Martha, don't you moan, she is moaning.
I found my reference. I think, Simon, we're looking at Deuteronomy 34, at the beginning of which we read, Moses went up to Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab and climbed Pisgah Peak, which is across from Jericho, as we all knew, obviously. And the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead as far as Dan, all the land of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah extending to the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the Jordan Valley with Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to Moses, this is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have now allowed you to see it with your own eyes, but you will not enter the land.
It's a good find.
Bible Gateway is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. That works too, doesn't it?
Tom Arthur, you're unmuted. Did you want to say something?
May I ask you something out of curiosity for someone who is not an expert on this? In order to get that kind of, impact from a musical viewpoint, how many people are supposed to sing? Is there any sort of, of course, I suppose this is spontaneous and you can have a meaningful effect even without gathering so many people. But from a musical point of view, how many people are required in order to get that kind of impact when people sing?
A really good question, and I think the answer is that there is no set answer. But if you look at how gospel music, the kind of gospel music we've been talking about, emerged, I guess there are three main groups that you'd want to think about. So there were the smallest group was a kind of would have been like a gospel quintet, something like that, about 5 people. And so, a lot of these musicians, people like the Caravans, who we saw a late manifestation of, they were touring groups. So, you needed to have enough people to be able to make a good sound and to sing in parts. Oh, here's one we prepared earlier. But we also you also needed to have, frankly, enough people, small enough people that you could get them all into a car, and that there was a reasonable chance of making enough money out of a, you know, out of a performance to feed everybody and get somewhere to stay for the night. So there was kind of economics around that. So I mean, I think that's your smallest group. Then you've got your gospel choir, which can be anything from a couple of dozen. I mean, I've been in big gospel churches in Harlem in New York, and you might have 100 people in the choir. There really is no limit. And then of course you've got the whole congregation, because the choir and the quintet are more in performance mode, but actually what you're seeking to do in worship is to engage everybody. So that could be 100, it could be 500, it could be 1,000 people. So I don't think there's a number you can put on it, but from my perspective anyway, those are the three kinds of size that you have, and they have different functions. Basically, the bigger it gets, the less it's about performance, and the more it's about everybody, you know, participating and worshiping together.
Anybody else got an observation they'd like to share? Julian?
Yes, I'd like to get back to Stephen's mother, because I think she had a quite interesting point that often comes up in this area. Is it the devil's music or is it gospel? So we have Mahalia Jackson, who refused to sing in a secular way, and who actually divorced her husband, who put pressure on her to try and move out of the Baptist church's circuit, was probably one of the greatest gospel singers of all time. And we also have Bob Dylan up in Hibbing, Minnesota, listening to Delta blues on his radio. And you've got some very interesting people who are trained up in a church gospel tradition, but who did move over to pop and blues. So, you know, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, Muddy Waters. And there is this kind of quite difficult matter sometimes of maneuvering around the devil's music. Bob Dylan nearly had a relationship with Mavis Staples, but her father put paid to that, and that was partly because of the devil's music which Bob Dylan at the time had got into. So are you skating on thin ice with some of this, or are you definitely assured that your mother is not going to be in some difficulty at your interest in this sort of area of music, moving over from gospel into blues and, dear oh dear, the devil's music of pop?
Well, I can't wait to tell my mother when I speak to her on the phone on Sunday that I was doing a Bible study at Bloomsbury Baptist Church, and somebody said, I think we should get back to talking about Stephen's mother. I think she's going to be, I'm going to need to explain what lay behind that. I think. I mean, it's really an interesting question, Julian, and you've thought about these things a lot, and you're very, very well informed. I'm impressed. I think, though, that there's something slightly different going on. So within American Christianity, and in different ways in different parts of the world as well, but we'll talk about American, you know, that there has been the kind of holiness tradition. It's very strong and powerful, and it defines, you know, living as a true Christian as being kind of separate from the world. So, you know, you try not to engage or to think about kind of, you know, worldly things, whatever is meant by that. And whatever is meant by that, it certainly includes, you know, drinking and dancing and, you know, going to clubs and thinking about thinking about sexual relationships and all of these kind of things, which, of course, if you remove those from the lyrics of the blues, then you've basically just turned it into an instrumental genre, because there isn't really anything left. And it's a very common story that soul, gospel, blues singers in the States found themselves navigating that line between the pressure from the church to, stay in the church, but then their own desires for success, or their feeling that they had more to give. And you can see that tension being lived out in the lives of people like Aretha Franklin, we've already mentioned, Sam Cooke, Al Green. I mean, all sorts of people. And but I think my own perspective would be that is not primarily to do with, whether the devil has all the good tunes. It's to do with the way in which the kind of holiness wing of Christianity in the States also maps. It's not coterminous with, but it has a significant overlap with the African American church. So where you find the holiness movement in the holiness Christianity in play, you find that suspicion about everything that's going on in the wider culture. And so people who came from that kind of background, were almost forced to make a choice. Well, if you're not only going to sing in church, you can't sing in church at all. But it wasn't only a black thing. Hank Williams released gospel records under the name Luke the Drifter. He reckoned that he could not do sort of country blues and gospel under the same name. You had to have two careers. Sam Cooke at one point was releasing records under different names, gospel and secular. So, it's an interesting question. I guess the question behind it for me would be, what was it about the experience of African American Christians that meant that they gravitated to the holiness wing rather than the more culture affirming manifestations of Christianity? And I think my best guess about that would be, if you have lived in a context which has, in a world which has oppressed, mistreated, beaten, sometimes killed, you and your loved ones, you and your ancestors, then you are going to be suspicious of that world. And therefore, when freedom comes, you can see why you'd say, we don't need any of that. We're going to create our own world, and it's going to be safe, and we're going to be in control, and we're not going to have to engage and participate any more than we really, really need to out there. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I would guess that that's one of the drivers for the influence of sort of holiness Christianity on African American spirituality.
Just to say, I think I'll let the discussion continue for another 5 to 10 minutes, because we started a little bit late, but we'll aim to finish it at about 20 to 9, because I know, several people are busy with other things that they wanted to do this evening. Was there anything else that people wanted to say about the Bible stories, either the liberation of the Israelites through the drowning of the Pharaoh's army, or the resurrection of Lazarus? Was there anybody who wanted to contribute any thoughts on those stories? Hazel, did you have some thoughts?
Hazel didn't, but I'll just make a comment, if I may, of a different kind. My idea of Negro spiritual type things is a very different one. Of that, the background to me is that most of these people, these things were written, I imagine, when they were in America as slaves, and they had every reason to be resentful of the way they were treated. There should be, you would think they would want to express revenge for the way they were treated. They were vindictive. Their slave masters were vindictive. And yet Negro spirituals of the sort that I'm more familiar with express a completely different approach, that they're very gentle, very moving, very simple messages. And I think of something like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. It's all, it's very looking forward, looking back at their history, but also looking forward. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Something to be carrying me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming to carry me home. It's all beautiful and totally at variance, it seems to me, with the experience they were, their lives in at the time they were written. It's just a completely different comment that I'm making about different sort of Negro spiritual type music.
So I wonder, John, if it is as different as all of that, because one way of understanding that specific song is that it's actually about the Freedom Railroad. So you know what I was saying about how the form was used to communicate, and the language is used to communicate a message which is actually subversive. And I think part of what's going on in Swing Low, Sweet Chariot is it's a song about the Freedom Railroad. It's a song about getting out of here, about being able to make our escape and to go north and to get off this plantation. So it's really interesting. So it functions at this level. You're quite right. I agree with everything you just said. It functions at this level, but it has a different symbolism, different meaning going on for those who know it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gillian, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Well, it's quite interesting that, John, you picked that, because that was written by a Native American Indian and then adapted later on. And I think if you look at the history of that, and particularly Joan Baez singing it in Woodstock and Martin Luther King, you've already referred to, it was very nicely adapted to the issue of civil rights. So it is a beautiful song. Interestingly, of course, in rugby at the moment, there's quite a discussion about it, because every time a black rugby player seems to come on the field, the crowd seems to sing it automatically, which may have other associations. So I would say you picked on something that is highly controversial and has been for some time. But there it is. If it's a lovely thing that you enjoy, well, that's what this is all about, isn't it? Lovely music.
That's an interesting subject to touch on, cultural appropriation of these songs. When the Saints Go Marching In, Steve and I went to school in Salisbury. The nearest big football team was in Southampton. Saturday afternoon, drunk football fans, where the sides, go marching in. But of course, the meaning of those songs in African American churches where they originated was very different. The symbolism and the reason, the way people thought about what saints were and what marching was, and why they wanted to be there, as we discussed earlier, was about the reunification of a separated community. So I think that's something that we'll have to come on to as we go through this series. What the songs have, how the songs have been picked up, and how they've been reinterpreted in different contexts. Tonight, I think we've just given a taster of one small area of a vast genre of music. one that you know, Steve and I have enjoyed a lot over many years, and it's been a super opportunity to get your responses to that material, and I hope that we'll be able to continue that conversation as we go through the series. Simon.
Just to say a huge thank you to Stephen for coming. It's been really good to welcome you to Bloomsbury, and to Duncan for dreaming up this new series and bringing it into being. I've learned a load tonight. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'd just like to apologise again for the technical problems with the Zoom link change. Who knew that it could be so hard? I will make extra efforts to make sure the correct Zoom links are in the emails that go out well in advance of next time. So hopefully none of us will end up in Duncan's meeting room again. Sorry, Nigel's meeting room. But anyway, thank you for coming this evening. It's been really good to see you all here, and see you soon, I'm sure. And if not somewhere else, see you here in a couple of weeks' time. Duncan, who have we got in 2 weeks? Who's our special guest, and what are we looking at?
We've got Adolka Meyer, who is 23 years old. Some of you may know Adolka because she comes to Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church, but her background is in West African Pentecostal churches in London. She's very passionate about gospel music and knows a lot about its history and heritage. But I've asked her particularly to talk about the ways in which Black majority churches in London use this form of music as part of their worship, and how she views the way we sing and use music in our Baptist church.
Sounds fascinating.
Steve, you've got to get used to seeing her as a blonde.
Yes, she has just gone blonde, hasn't she?
So cool.
Right, yes, Udoka is one of our church members. Okay, great. Thank you all. Let's get on with our evenings, and see you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hello, Richard. Lovely to see you. Yeah, I can't hear you because you're on mute, but it's really nice to see you. We're going to be turning the meeting off now, so I'm going to say goodbye, okay?
Bye, Richard.
Bye, Richard. See you soon. Bye.